Welcome back to this last session of the first block. In this session, I will talk about the two main perspectives from which urban infrastructure systems can and should be analyzed in an intellectually coherent manner. These are the public policy perspective and the public economy perspective. Both perspectives are coherent and both perspectives are based on a series of assumptions. Let's first talk about the public policy perspective. The public policy perspective caters to the citizen before it caters to the customer. And the citizen is entitled to receive public services in terms of their accessibility, their quality, their affordability, and their equity. This means, for example, that public transport should be close to where people need it. It is in good quality, it is reliable, it is affordable, so also the poor people can afford it, and it is provided in an equitable manner, meaning that citizens all around the city have access to it. Now, if these services cannot be self-financing, then public money, subsidies, can be paid or will be paid to offer these public services. That is, the money is not really the first focus. The focus is the services, and if the money is not sufficient by what the customers pay, the public authorities will pay the difference. So the underlying assumption of this public policy perspective is that the public services should be maximized. The citizens who live in a city should be receiving the best possible public services. Of course, there are financial limits you have to consider, but before all, it's the services that are important. Now, the way of providing these services is also coherent with this approach. It is basically political steering that guides, because those are political objectives. The services are provided in a way that politics controls them. Historically, this is the case of ownership. We talk here about integrated municipal public enterprises, like a bus enterprise, a public transport entity, a public energy entity, a public water company. They own the services, they provide the services, and they own the infrastructure. In some countries, we talk about integrated even utilities, where the water and the energy company and even the transport company sometimes are integrated in one big municipal service. Now, increasingly, the same public provision of the services can be rendered by way of contract. So you may have private operators or even public operators for that matter, but the political steering occurs by the fact that the public authorities contract with this operator. They fix the objectives that the operator has to reach, again, as I said before, in terms of accessibility, quality, affordability, and equity. And if the operator does not make enough money from these services, he is then subsidized by the public authorities. Now, this public policy perspective contrasts with a public economy perspective. It must be said that this public economy perspective has emerged more recently around the end of the 1980s, the early 1990s, in the general context of liberalization and globalization. But this perspective is equally coherent as the previous perspective. Now, at the end of that perspective, we have the customer before the citizen. The idea is that the services, the public services that are delivered are first of all catering to customers. And the customers should pay for these services so they can be profitable or at least covering the costs of providing them. This is a basic principle of this perspective. Now, there are, of course, services which cannot be profitable. We have seen previously in the course, we have talked about the public goods, for example, like street lighting, which nobody is prepared to pay for. In other words, from an economic point of view, this means that there are market failures. In this case, this perspective, the public economy perspective, allows for subsidies, but it allows for subsidies only in the case of market failure. The assumption here is totally different from the previous perspective. The assumption is that economic growth should be maximized, and the infrastructure services are participating in the economic growth of a city. If the company that provides these services is doing well, this will ultimately be beneficial for the entire city and for the welfare of all the inhabitants of the city. In terms of way of providing, we also have a very different approach from the previous one. So since the goal is somehow the customer, the competition is seen as the best way of providing these services. And that means that there should be some sort of competition, let's say, between water companies or between transport companies. And it is the competition that actually guarantees the efficiency and the quality of the services. Of course, since we are dealing with infrastructures here, competition is always accompanied by regulation. And regulation means that to make sure that the competitors are not discriminated against, that they can use the physical infrastructure to provide the services. And therefore, there's another principle that is important here. It's this principle of unbundling. In order to create competition, of course, you have to separate between the services, which are competitive, and the infrastructure, which remains monopolistic, and that calls for all kind of regulations to make this happen. So we have clearly seen two different perspectives on how to govern and how to approach the infrastructure systems in a city. The public economy perspective based on markets and competition, and the public policy perspective based on integrated municipal companies or contract. Now, to conclude this first block, which was about basically introducing to urban infrastructure systems, we have seen how these systems are structured, the different dimensions of them. We have talked about economic dimensions and others. And just before, we have looked at the different ways, the different perspectives from which they can be approached in a coherent way. The next block will be about managing these same urban infrastructure systems. Stay tuned.